Good afternoon, everyone. I think when we adjourned for lunch, I said I was going to come to Ms. Harding next.
Thank you. Yes, I think I was just going to mention again about the Sedgefield and emphasise that this is people with homes, people in need of those homes. So that's, well, lost the piece with the figures on. So that shortfall of 343 homes, I do think it's appropriate that it should be addressed in the first 5 years following the Sedgefield method. As the Councillor Boyd had pointed out, that they have the opportunity to do that in terms of what they have in terms of their supply. So I think that would be in line with the NPPF paragraph 47, which looks to boost the supply. And as I say, it would address those people that are currently in need in terms of that shortfall. I think it also saves issues in terms of once the plan is adopted and is judged against the newest PPG in terms of its approach. I think that also would be beneficial. Thank you.
Mr. Elvin, I don't know if there was anything that you needed to respond to now. Are there any other submissions on 5.7? It's about requirement. Shall we move on then to the rolling 5-year housing land supply upon adoption of the plan? That's 5.8. 5.9 goes into windfalls again, and we may have already covered that. Sorry, but yeah, I mean, it may be, looking at this, it may be that we may be able to cover 5.8 to 5.12 together. So if I'm quite relaxed about that. What do you think, Mr. Elwood?
The more we do at once, the better, I think, at this stage.
I'm happy. Carry on then. If you want to introduce the whole rolling supply. Yeah.
Sure, thank you. Yes, again, the paper that was presented yesterday evening provides an update to what we submitted as part of the hearing statement. So table, just bear with me a second, table 6 of the hearing statement sought to present the rolling 5-year supply with built in to those estimated completions was the windfall estimate and that 10% non-implementation rate. What it didn't do was account for any rolling shortfall within that. So that was simply a calculation of assumed supply rather than the full calculation. What we've sought to do with the update to the trajectory at the bottom of the table is give an indication of what that 5-year supply as a calculation would look like. So that is row row P provides the 5-year calculation, where we, in effect, there don't give any account for oversupply. That will, in theory, has been delivered in advance of what we've projected. So it's a rolling supply looking forward, which is why, if you look at the end of the plan period, you'll see that the figures dip ever so slightly below. We would say that that's to be expected on the basis of that calculation, because we are entering the end of the plan period. There has been advanced delivery, and that would not be unusual in that respect. And in any case, we would have updated and reviewed the plan by that point anyway, one would hope. As a comparison to that, we have done the same calculation in rows Q and R, but in this case taken account of that, in effect, advanced delivery, and measured that against what would be a 5-year land supply position using those figures. And as you can see, it becomes a far healthier position, because you've accounted for previous delivery, which we've forecasted. In both of those, just also worth stressing that the windfalls and the non-implementation rate's been applied, and also the buffer as proposed in rows, K and L. We referred to this morning the 20% buffer that we're applying to the 5-year calculation at the moment. What the trajectory as updated has allowed us to do is identify the point at which we believe we will start to demonstrate a consistent delivery against our requirement, and demonstrate that we haven't had a kind of persistent under-delivery. And at that point in time, we apply a 5% buffer, which is in year 27-28. And that remains 5 years at 5% for the remaining 6 years of the plan at that point. I think that's all there is to say on that one for now.
I think it also answers 510. Is it up to date? Yes, as of yesterday. I thought I'd put in a quick cheeky response.
Good, that's very helpful. I'm going to open it up for submissions. I'll come to you, Mr. Alsbury, first.
Thank you, sir. I'm only speaking to inform you that I will be including in the document that I'm going to produce for the council our calculations on 5-year land supply. It'll come as no surprise to you that with us reaching different conclusions on the deliverability of sites within the next 5 years, we have a different set of calculations. So I'll set those out clearly, that no need to go through those now, they'll be in writing.
I'm content with that, thank you. Mr. Johnson, then, I'll come to you.
Thank you, sir. I think bearing in mind is that we've got this material only last night, then again, if there's anything to be put in writing later. I think the first thing that does strike me, though, from the material with respect to the sites with planning permission to be delivered within the next 5 years, is if I can take you to table, the tables from page 6 onwards, and it raises the point about the 10% non-implementation point, whether or not it's enough. And if I can take you to page 6 as a starting point. And
sorry, page 6 of the
paper that came out, yes, it's the one with the pink.
I've got it on one sheet, so you'll have to
sorry,
name
so
it.
there's the rest of that document. That one sheet was page 5. Yeah, and thereafter it's page 6. And what you get is a list of the planning permissions, in effect, of different scales. And always when we're doing a housing land supply assessment ourselves, whether it's on a 5-year land supply, is we tend to look at the age of the permissions and the nature in which the delivery falls within the 5 years and where within the 5 years that it falls. And I'm not going to run through all of these, but what I would ask you to do is to cast your eye down the list, starting from page 6 at the very top. And there's quite a few over the next few pages that look like this, is that you've got 2005 permissions or applications, 2009, 2012, and the majority of that first page is. And where you see single dwellings falling into years 4 and 5, then you have to question as to whether or not that very old planning permission is ever going to deliver within the 5 years. And it's not just that sheet. As you take over onto page 8 and 10 in particular, again, if you go to the bottom of page 10, you'll see a series of cases where you get some very old planning permissions that miraculously end up delivering the entire requirement in the 5th year. And I'm not going to go through all of them now, but what I would like to just highlight is our concern is that there are some very old planning permissions that seem to make it into the final year of the 5-year land supply assessment with actually no information. And I know under the NPPF we're asked to demonstrate ourselves if we've got doubt on planning permissions as to whether or not we can demonstrate why it shouldn't be there. All I'm doing is highlighting the point is that there are some very old permissions that appear in the 5-year land supply in the very final years, and I think the justification from the council's case could be a little bit better, but accepting the fact that there's a large number of very small sites, and in which case it brings me to the point of the implementation rate. Is the implementation...
My apologies, forgive me, Mr Johnson. Yeah, I just want to check something. I mean, we're taking the year from the planning application
Correct.
Reference number, aren't we?
We are, sir, and not the date it was consented. But I think
I just wonder, do we know, I mean, just as a matter of fact, do we know that these are old permissions, or might they be applications that the council pondered for a while?
Well, sir, I'm looking at page 10, and near the top I can see 2005. I mean, I know, you know, the council's delivery on planning approvals can sometimes be a little bit slow, but I think in certain cases here is that, you know, these are ancient in anybody's books, and I think I'm making the point about the 10% non-implementation rate as to whether or not that could actually be, for some of these, significantly higher, or as a block, overall, 15% or even 20%.
Mr. Owen, you have a response to that?
Just 2 points. One, we haven't got to overlook the fact the requirements for what deliverable sites are in the NPPF, which is footnote 11 on paragraph 47, and that we're applying a 10% non-implementation rate as well. So that takes account of the fact that some permissions will not come forward.
Thank you. Yeah, the point was made that maybe that should be a little, perhaps that non-implementation rate should be a little higher, but you're obviously of a view that 10% is reasonable.
We are indeed. I think we would argue it's more than reasonable. I think it's in some ways unusual to apply such a rate across the board. Our evidence in the SHLA looks at implementation rates, and I think it draws to a 7% based on evidence, and so a 10% figure was seen as reasonable in that context.
That's helpful, thank you. Is there anyone else who wants to make a submission on these, or this group of questions? Mr. Gartland.
Thank you. So could I just make one point in relation to the windfalls included in the last 2 years of the 5-year period? And our suggestion is that there's no windfalls accounted for within the first 5 years period. Going back to the footnote to the PPG, really, which has updated the definition of what is deliverable, where pretty compelling evidence has to be shown as to the ability to secure a completion within the period. And the windfall allowance is simply doesn't do that.
My apologies, it's my fault, no doubt, but I'm sorry, I didn't follow that. Could you run that past me again?
Certainly, the last 2 years of the 5-year period have a windfall allowance included within it, and I'm questioning whether that's appropriate on the basis of the definition of deliverability. I know we're working on the old NPPF, but the updated version does actually go into some detail about how that can be defined. and as a windfall allowance, that number of dwellings is not identified. In fact, there's no evidence of where those sites are, for example, because there can't be, because it's just a windfall allowance taken out of a trend.
Is that not the nature of including an allowance for windfalls, though? They're not forecastable. We went through how the
Yes.
figure's been arrived at, and so I'm not really understanding. Forgive me.
Yes, but what I'm saying is because the first 5-year period has to define the deliverable component of the supply, that by definition windfalls can't fall into that category.
Well, I understand the point you're making.
Well,
Mr. Alwyn?
well, the fact is that there are a number of components, as you know, and under the NPPF we're working to, you've got the identification of specific deliverable sites in paragraph 47, and then you've got windfalls in 48, and it's perfectly acceptable to add windfalls to the supply, because otherwise you're looking at an unrealistic. Come to get me. You're looking at an unrealistic position. We've already discussed why we delayed the windfalls addition, but we've already explained that, and it doesn't seem to me that what's being said is justified by looking at paragraphs 47 and 48 of the 2012 NPPF.
I think just to follow on with that, if we were to reverse that logic and take out those small sites and replace it with the windfall allowance, then we would actually propose a higher supply on that basis. So we get 366 is the total of those small sites. If we were to replace that with the windfall allowance over 3 years, you would be just short of 600.
I see the point. Mr. Gartland, was there anything you wanted to come back on there?
Nothing to come back on. I didn't quite understand the last point that was made. That's all, in terms of the replacement of windfalls by the small sites allowance.
I think we were just being shown perhaps a different approach that could perhaps have been taken to that between small sites and windfalls. But yeah. Anyone else got anything they'd like to say on this group of questions? One more chance. Good. In which case, I'm content, and we'll complete the hearing for today. Back again tomorrow morning to talk about greenbelt boundaries, or the approach to setting greenbelt boundaries at 9:30. Until then, thank you. Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
very much. Thank you.